Hello, Rams, and welcome to another episode of Rams History. Now, today's topic will be the Crimean War. So just to get a fix on our position here, the Crimea is a peninsula located in the southern part of Russia. As you can see, it sort of juts out into the Black Sea. And you'll also notice that it's not too far from Turkey, which was the other adversary in this conflict, being known at the time as the Ottoman Empire. So this sort of sets the stage for our little show here today. And this is a pretty strategic area for a number of reasons, primarily because of what were known as the Straits of the Dardanelles, a narrow passage from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. And essentially, whoever controls the Dardanelles can control shipping traffic through the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. So this is a pretty important area. In fact, later in World War I, this will be a scene of a battle known as Gallipoli, once again over the Straits of the Dardanelles. But the situation here is that you have a crisis brewing in a geographically significant area to Europe, and this is partly why the conflict will become such a serious one. Now, the Ottoman Empire at the time was in a state of terminal decline. It was widely known as the sick man of Europe. And in fact, the Ottoman Empire only has a few decades left. It will cease to exist during World War I. So basically, this is in many ways a story of European powers viewing a much weaker rival and essentially looking at the territory there and realizing that perhaps some of this could be up for grabs. Now, the British and French were perhaps a little bit cynical here as well. The war was definitely posed as a war to go to the aid of Turkey. You know, here we see the Russian bear sort of embracing a rather reluctant Turkey. And of course, the British and French certainly posed this to their people as a, conflict to aid a much weaker Turkish empire. But in reality, the British and French had motives of their own as well. They, like the Russians, were sort of looking at the territory in the Ottoman Empire, thinking about its importance to their own strategic goals, and perhaps even considering that there may be some territory there up for grabs as well. So there was a lot of certainly high-level talk about preserving Turkey's integrity and things along those lines, but in many ways, for the Russians and perhaps for the British and French, this was a war that really said more about their own personal needs and gains rather than, coming to the assistance of a weakened Turkey. Now, France and Russia in particular had some pretty strained relations. Actually, it went all the way back to when Napoleon III assumed the throne of France. Now, remember, Napoleon had staged something of a coup d'etat. He had been elected as the president of France, and then at the end of his term, he decided essentially to make himself emperor of the French. Nicholas I of Russia really did not regard Napoleon as a legitimate leader. And in fact, when Napoleon took the throne, Nicholas sent him a telegram, essentially calling him mon ami instead of mon frère, my friend instead of my brother. Now, this may seem a bit silly to us today, but in the diplomatic language of the time, this was a pretty significant snub. Calling him my friend instead of my brother implied that he was not an equal, and it was also a little bit less intimate. So really, from the beginning of Napoleon's rule in France, he had regarded Nicholas somewhat icily. So overall here, what are the goals? Well, the Russians have a couple of goals. Part of it is religious. The Ottoman Empire, as you know, was Muslim, and the Russians, of course, were Orthodox Christians. Now, there were a large number of Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and Russia had traditionally been their protector. Now, the French, of course, which were largely Roman Catholic, believed it was their duty to protect Christians in the Ottoman Empire. And part of this dispute boils down to really sort of who had the right to protect Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Was it the right of the French Roman Catholics, or was it the right of the Russian Eastern Orthodox Christians? Now, again, it may sound silly to us today, but remember there was a great deal of prestige tied up in this. And for Napoleon, it was a source of potential popularity, right? France was largely Roman Catholic, And if he could be seen as supporting Roman Catholics in the Ottoman Empire, it might win him some support. Now, the Russians' true goal, in many ways, was to basically try to extend control over Ottoman territory. They're looking essentially to grab some space. Now, as far as the British and French, obviously they have goals of their own. Main part of it is to try to oppose Russian expansion. Now, remember, particularly the British, they have a major colony in India, and the last thing they want is a potential opponent blocking access to their colony in India. Of course, the British also have trade goals in the Mediterranean as well. The French have many of the same goals as the British. They hope to trade there, and of course they have interests in the area. And Napoleon III has, again, a domestic political goal. He believed that a successful war against Russia would increase his popularity, which had been declining in France. Now, this war was really the first war to be very widely photographed. Photography had been becoming a practical art by this time. Cameras were portable. And although the photographs by our standards today were somewhat primitive, they were actually quite well done. This war was also one of the first to be very widely covered by war correspondents, reporters in the field sending dispatches home. This in particular had a big impact on public opinion, especially in Britain, as reporters were writing about the suffering of British soldiers due to lack of equipment, lack of medicine, poor food, and poor hygiene. This did create quite a sensation in the British press. Now, as far as this war being conducted in a competent manner, it really wasn't. None of the armies in this respect really covered themselves in glory. There were serious problems of supply, of illness, of disease. If you look at this chart, which is the causes of mortality for the British Army in the Crimea, the blue triangles represent deaths by disease. The black triangles represent deaths from other causes, perhaps accidents or suicides, what have you. And the red triangles actually represent deaths from wounds in battle. And as you can easily see, disease was the largest killer of this war. Things like cholera and typhus killed soldiers by the thousands. So the medical condition of the armies in the Crimea was very poor. And in fact, more soldiers would die of sickness than from any other cause. Now, one of the most famous individuals to come out of the Crimean War, and perhaps one of the reasons why most people remember the Crimean War, is Florence Nightingale. As I mentioned, this war was widely covered in the press at the time, and reporters wrote very moving articles about the sufferings of the soldiers. Now, in response to this, there were some reforms made, especially in the British Army, as regards medical care and the treatment of the sick. And one of those reforms was to allow female nurses to take part in the treatment of the sick and wounded. Florence Nightingale became one of the most famous of those nurses and remains something of a hero today in British history. Now, sort of another example of the incompetence with how these affairs were conducted is the other reason that people remember the Crimean War, and that, of course, is the charge of the Light Brigade. There was a battle outside the city of Balaclava between the Russians, the British, and the French. And during this battle, there was a confusing series of orders transmitted to this cavalry unit known as the Light Brigade. This confusing series of orders resulted in the Light Brigade charging through a valley, which was ringed by Russian guns on both sides, and the Light Brigade was largely decimated. They were cut to pieces by Russian artillery fire. Now, after the war, in fact, for decades, there would be recriminations between various parties in the British Army as to who ordered this charge and who was responsible for this disaster. But it did generate perhaps one of the most famous photographs of the Crimean War. This is the actual valley through which the Light Brigade charged. And as you can see, it's simply littered with cannonballs and shrapnel, the remainders of the Russian artillery fire that rained down on the men and horses of the Light Brigade. So what are the results here, ladies and gentlemen? Well, Russia does lose the war, and they actually withdraw from several Ottoman territories known as Moldavia and Wallachia that they had occupied. Russia's image was shattered. there had been this impression in Europe of the invincible Russian bear, especially after Napoleon's defeat there in 1812. Well, that image is now gone. Russia is seen nearly as weak as the Ottoman Empire. As a result of this, both Russia and the Ottoman Empire would begin internal reforms. They would try to slow their downward decline. However, both of these political entities are in their final decades, and neither would survive World War I. Both of them would cease to exist during the Great War. Metternich's Concert of Europe was now completely broken down. The system by which the European powers would try to maintain a balance and try to prevent revolutions and things had already begun breaking down in 1848. Crimean War pretty much finishes it off. Now again, Europe will enter a period of instability, especially with the unifications of Italy and Germany. Now, Austria is really the odd man out here because essentially their behavior had angered both sides, the Russians and the British and French, and Austria would wind up becoming isolated essentially from the rest of Europe right at the moment when it really needed some friends, because of course this is right about the time that Bismarck will begin his unification of Germany, and Austria will not find too many people willing to help. Now, interestingly enough, ladies and gentlemen, the Crimea is still very much in the news. Just a short time ago, a few years ago, Vladimir Putin made a power grab to grab the Crimea away from Ukraine. So it's actually still a region that is a source of conflict to this day. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this look at the Crimean War. So as always, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon.